I did it all for the money. When the player had to eat, that one the damn thing funny. Hey, I did it all for the money. Hey, I did it all before. Rob people so dope. Gang banging, shooting pistols, running from the dance folks. And I was known for getting anything your ass folks. Soft, hard, green, brown, niggas even had
Don't get up here and whine about the crime in Albuquerque, but then we don't need police reform. We don't need police reform. We need politicians to leave the police alone. But then you had last year during COVID, during the shutdown, where you had, so much businesses shut down and traffic and just in general activity. You had I want to say a record number of police misconduct reports. So you can't blame that on the mayor. You can't blame that on the police chief. Someone who has misconduct, that is a cultural problem within the department. So that's where the reform is needed. See, these people who march and protest and picket and do all these, make these nice signs for their protests, they fail to see. You have to sit down and actually tell them what you want. You can't just scream police reform, prison reform. You have to actually tell them what you want in your prison reform. And so that's the problem here, that none of these people see any problem with police misconduct. But how can I say this? You have the record number of police misconducts report last year, and then also the problem with that is that, like I said, this is where you cancel culture vultures kind of make sick, because like none of you people have lived in the war zone. None of you people have lived in the highest crime area in the city. None of you have. Going from the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, over 3 decades living in that area. So going from, when Trumbull Park was nice and, there wasn't any crack in that neighborhood and stuff like that, to its current condition, a lot of things have changed. And you've had all these politicians. It's not like you've never had a Republican who's been in office, who's put bills into practice or anything like that. Y'all need to stop playing politics. Period. Let's get some results. Let's get some solutions. In the 90s, you had substations. You had a substation at the McDonald's on Wyoming. I'm sorry, the gas station across from the McDonald's on Wyoming. That was a substation. You had a substation at the Circle K at Copper and Wyoming. You had a substation at the Circle K at Pennsylvania in Central. You had a substation at the Circle K at Utah in Zuni. You had a substation at the Circle K at Trumbull and Louisiana. Okay. Try to think where else there was substation. You had a substation at San Pedro and San Mateo at the Circle K. You had a substation at the 7-Eleven on Catherine and San Mateo. You had a substation at the 7-Eleven in Nob Hill on Central, just right before you get to Girard. The 90s, where 3 or 4 police cars would be parked. They were spread out throughout the city. Now, you had gangs. The guy who shot the police the other day, 3 or 4 police or whatever the other day. You had big gangs from Cali, big gang members from Cali coming in and actually shooting people. And the police can tell you this story when the Serenios came and they were targeting black people in that neighborhood. You had gangs from everywhere: Crips, Bloods, Vice Lords, GDs, Blackstones, Serenios, local gangs. There was other substations down off of the 7-Eleven off of Cesar Chavez and Yale, the 7-Eleven off Broadway and Gibson. So you had these were spread out throughout from basically back in the 90s from Central Avenue, all the hotels from Central Avenue, early 90s to when they started tearing the hotels down. You people who've been here know this. So from downtown all the way up, just say Central, the entirety is Central, except in a few areas, but from Central to Nob Hill was rough. It was a little rough patch. You got a little break in between the university, but all the hotels in the Edo, downtown from Broadway to the hospital, all those hotels were run down, crack and drug infested. Every single last one of them. And that neighborhood going all the way down from Central to Gibson was a rough area. You had a decent amount of houses from, I want to say, and the neighborhood was decent from Central to about Santa Fe or something like that. And then from there on the other side of that, you from Eugene Field on that way, you had pretty much gangs infested in that neighborhood. The black gangs, you had the Hoovers there, you had the Gilla Park Crips there, and some other Crips that went all the way through the sticks, all the way to Gibson. And then on the other side of Broadway, you had San Jose immediately. So here's the Crip neighborhood on this side of Broadway. On that side of Broadway, you had the Mexican gang, San Jose, South Side San Jose, and East Side San Jose, all the way down to West Meco, whatever that street is. So from Cesar Chavez and Broadway all the way down. So those are two areas gang infested. You go up on the other side of the freeway, you had the Kirtland edition, you had the Kurtown Blood, Kurtown Pyru. So you had all these gangs in the immediate area. Then you skip over behind the golf course, go further up, and you start getting into the international district. Once you hit San Mateo, you have bits and pockets, but it really wasn't that rough in the 90s until you got to Georgia Street. Once you got to Georgia Street, and then you had Ortiz over there by Bell and Gibson. And so pretty much, yeah, from San Pedro and Zuni to San Pedro and Zuni, those pockets of apartments that was rough and infested. And in between Central and Zuni, you had a bunch of mobile home parks that were infested. And then you had on Central the apartments. So you had a wide area before you got to the actual war zone that were infested. And then once you got to the war zone, you had gangs you were going to have to deal with in the war zone. You had the JMV, the Guaritos from California, who were here since probably the 70s, late 70s or early 80s. And then you had the BMCD Black Mafias, Crips, JoJo Pounds, and all those guys. And then you had 30s, 40s, 60s, and then by like 92 you started having Blackstones and Vice Lords along in there with that. And by 94 the gang culture was more popular than anything in the city. So you had a wide amount of gangs, not to mention the graffiti cliques, Uptown Kings, and just so many people from the 80s and 90s that there was so many gangs in 94 infested in that area. And the police officers who policed that area will tell you there was 10 to 20 gang members on every corner. They would saturate this area on the weekends. They would do marches with the community organizations and protest and stop and march. That's all. So there's so much against protesting, but I remember them going and marching in front of these crack houses and houses that would be deemed crack houses. I remember them going to my friend's house because everybody of his house, it wasn't drugs over there, but everybody who sold drugs would go to his house to hang out. And so it would be known as where the drug dealers would hang out. The young teenage drug dealers would hang out. They would go march in front of his house and stuff like that, but all in the international district. So these were certain tactics. They would put roadblocks out on Fridays, And I can guarantee you that the budget that they were using back in '94 for these to police these communities was way less than the budget and the overtime that they're getting now. And the community policing tactics were way more face to face versus like now you call them and they will not show up unless somebody's actively raping somebody or actively shooting somebody, and you actually see and confirm it. You know, so that's where a lot of you people who get out and complain about the protesters and people talking about police reform and prison reform, all you cancel culture vultures. It's the nonsense talking about. So in the '90s, you had all these different policing tactics, and these should be on the book, so you can go and compare what they did then, and what they do now. It's coming from somebody who actually had to live there. I actually one time I lived on Dallas Street. One time I left on Pennsylvania in Zuni, got pulled over. By the time I got to Pennsylvania and Bell, there was another police right there who stopped me, just had saw me get searched by the other car, at the other corner, and saw the lights, drive up the block to them. That made me get out, search my car again, and then I had to make a right turn on the Bell Street. By the time I got to Charleston, this is 2 blocks away, another roadblock there. So these are the things they would do in this community to stop the level of drugs and crime. And back then, the crime and the drugs were way more infested than it is now. Now you have fentanyl, meth, and you have crackheads dealing it. You don't have drug dealers who are actually gangbangers who are actually out there trying to make a living, and this is what they do. Now you have actual meth heads and people who use these drugs who are actually the dealers out there. You don't have people who are gang banging against each other for territory of these neighborhoods or for disagreements or just because they're gang members and they're gang banging. You don't have that. So you don't have the level of guns that were out on the streets. You don't have the level of individuals, the caliber of individuals that you had on the streets back then with guns were way different in the caliber and the number of people you have on the streets. What you have now is a meth and opioid fueled individuals out on these streets. So it may dangerous, a little bit dangerous, but it's nonetheless it's going to be less of those guys around than you had the gang members from the '90s, because that was just in the international district. You had people on Yola in the Los Arcos all the way down from Bell to Trumbull, and Pablo had drugs on it. And then where we would find a lot of gang members, then you go up different pocket members, different people at Verde Park. You would have different people in Tennessee, Joe in Pennsylvania, those apartments on Hill, those were infested. And you had Texas in Copper, Texas in Chico, from Texas and Chico to Texas and Marquette, all of that entire stretch, Texas was. So you had all of these streets, and you had General Arnold, General Stilwell, you had these apartments, General Chenal, those apartments, and you had the economy, the desert sand, I mean, the list goes on and on, the yucca, I mean, I could just go on all the hotels that got tore down. I mean, we can go books and just look at them all up. All those were infested, major. Not to mention all of just the freelance crime you had on Central, from prostitution to whatever. The property crime was just as bad. You know, you had people at that time who were on missions to go and get stuff, not like these guys nowadays who are doing it to survive. Like, these people made a living to feed their habit, and kids took advantage of that and made a lot of money during their time. If they don't tell you that the economy and all those hotels were infested, and there was so many drug dealers out there making. There was millions running through the city back then. So, but the gangs were different. The threat level was different. Not to mention you had so much the gangs. I mean, the people in Western Skies, once that got rough in the hotels in that area, and that's just the east side. So once we start going into Borellas and Martinez Town and Duranes and Trisco, West Side Locos. I mean, this goes on and on. The cruising on Central. So you had all that going on Friday night while all the hustling was going on the east side. So you had an entire blanket of crime in the city going on during the 90s for a good 20 to 15 years, from the 90s to mid to late 2000s. Now you don't have, you point out somewhere where you can go anywhere in the international district and there's going to be more than 4 corners on that neighborhood where there's going to be 10 to 20 gang members. Just any given time, you're going to be able to drive from Lomas, just say Marquette in Wisconsin, to Louisiana and Trumbull, and you're probably going to see about over 100 gang members easily, who all had guns on them at that time. Easily. You don't see that now. For these police officers to whine about the type of crime they're facing and their hands are tied, you have nothing that these guys who were there in the 90s had way more to deal with as far as gang members and a threat posed to their life than you. And that's a fact. That's just a fact. Kirky, you're going to have more meth heads than you have gang members or drug dealers. And back then it was probably 50-50. Now it's probably like 15% to 85% is drug addicts. 85% drug addicts, 15% is going to be gang members and possibly drug dealers in these areas. So the work you have is cut out for you. It's not the same as the police and practices in the 90s. So you guys got a bigger budget than them guys. You're getting paid way more than those guys were, and you're not going after the higher level of criminals, the more rugged, aggressive criminals that you had in the 90s. So it's ridiculous, some of the excuses that Sean Willoughby makes up when he gets on the news and starts whining. 4 police officers get shot. The first thing he wants to do is blame the police chief and the mayor. The mayor and the police chief, I mean, so they made this guy go and shoot somebody. That's the part that kills me. These people just out of their behind, and people eat it up. This guy eating it up. I mean, your boy from the back for the Cowboys, they're eating it up. You know what I mean? So it is, man. We need to wake up, stop falling for the okie doke. But yeah, this is what's going on in our city. And so you want to have one of the guys who's created this culture of whining but not actually doing any policing in the community, community police like they did in the 90s or anything like that. And this guy wants to run for mayor. He wants to run our city after on his watch the city's blown up in crime. It's ridiculous. So that's Manny Aragon, that's the law enforcement. These guys want to, you got to walk on eggshells dealing with these guys. These guys, they bust a grape and, they're looking around like, you say something and you against them. So these guys know what they do when they be out there. They know the level of misconduct in the city, but people want to sweep it under the rug. So you voting for this guy is just pacifying all the misconduct in the city. He wasn't able to solve any of the crime as sheriff, so you really actually think he's going to be able to solve crime as the mayor? Come on, y'all fooling yourself. Yeah, like I said, let's do a quick recap. So you had the sheriff who got denied funding because he submitted some false signatures and admitted to the signatures being false. What kind of law enforcement official submits off the fraudulent signatures? That's somebody who's a criminal. So automatically, just, I mean, if I were to do that, you know, he's a criminal, he's trying to cheat, da 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 da. Y'all stay tuned, y'all stay blessed.
Hey, I did it all for the money. Hey, I did it all for the money. When the player had to eat, that one a damn thing funny. Hey, I did it all for the money. Hey, I did it all before. Ride people so dope. Gang banging, shooting pistols, running from the dance folks. And I was known for eating anything you asked for. So